like I mentioned before, that vascular damage can be coming from a lot of different areas, right? And insulin resistance for sure is causing that vascular damage. Stress in general is definitely not doing anything good for that vascular integrity. So again, when we look at insulin resistance and vascular health, it goes kind of hand in hand. We know that during the progression of insulin resistance, as blood sugar levels are higher and higher, as insulin levels are higher and higher, advanced glycation end products, you can get into these kind of things too, which are just basically, the way I usually put it is, we don't want a lot of stuff in your blood. This is a lot of stuff to be in the blood at one time. You know what I mean? You start seeing this kind of cascade of basically too many things being in the blood at once. And think of anything that is in a confined area and there's too much of it and there only should be a certain amount of it, then that's eventually going to compromise the structure and integrity of whatever's holding it. It's kind of the way I think about it and the way that I explain to members. They're like, okay, what's going on here? Are you saying glycation end products and insulin is low and high and blood sugar? I just say, you know what? There's too much stuff in your blood at one time. Think of it that way. And that's going to eventually mess up the lining of these blood vessels. And that's not the only angle that you're disrupting your overall wellness. This is also going to impact your testosterone levels. Again, that's going to in turn impact the nitric oxide production that leads to healthy erections. There's a lot of different angles you can kind of do this, but again, the insulin resistance that is definitely contributing to that vascular damage. The fact that that testosterone levels are lower in the setting of insulin resistance is super important to understand for sure.
So cardiovascular health, insulin does a whole lot of bad things to your vascular system. It hardens things. It makes them stiffer. It keeps you, like you mentioned, you've got a decrease in nitric oxide. So you're not vasodilating the way you need to. Everything just kind of becomes stiff and non-compliant as it should be. And then the advanced glycation end products, I just tell people that their cells are caramelizing. Like the way I think of it mechanistically is like a caramelization. Just not to get too nerdy, but like sugars, most of the cellular receptors are contingent on some kind of sugary something to make it go, like things stick together, bind appropriately. There's always some kind of mechanism in there with glucose, and we don't want those caramelizing. And then just to throw another wrench in it, you'll see ferritin levels go up. Ferritin is the iron storage molecule in your blood, and when the body is inflamed, ferritin levels can increase. And I only say this because this is a very common thing I see in men as they hit middle age, is these ever rising ferritin levels. And they're told to go donate blood to get that iron off because iron rusts. So now you've got like caramelizing, heated up sugars, rusting iron. And to really make it kind of kindergarten version, right? But this is how I explain it to patients. I'm like, you've got excess iron because of the inflammation, and you've got everything in there caramelizing. So you're rusting at an increased rate inside the vessels. This is not good. So you're right. I like that, what you said, like there's just too much stuff in the blood. And I call it thick blood. I'm like, your blood is thick and this is not ideal. But they'll be told to go donate blood very often. And if they don't have some kind of genetic hemochromatosis, it's more like a functional hemochromatosis. That is not a good place to be as a middle-aged man, especially if you're rocking a belly and your testosterone's low and that the T is turning into estrogen. The issue with getting ferritin back down, in most cases, I saw this a lot, and because I was looking for it in clinic, the best way to handle this is to get your inflammation low, right? And bring your inflammation down. And that can really only be achieved with healthy testosterone levels and good metabolic health. So again, that chicken and egg kind of, it's a vicious cycle that men will get into, and they'll end up in my office in their 50s. And I'm like, oh, this is a hot mess. It's a hot mess of sludgy blood, and taking it all apart and trying to fix it is not as simple as just shooting testosterone. That's what I want guys to take home from this episode, is that testosterone replacement therapy is so important, or just optimizing, like you said, young men. I saw really low T levels in young men very often, more and more and more, as I closed my practice in like 2019. But from the time I got my license and was looking for this, because I was looking at metabolic health long before it was cool, way back when, until the time I left practice, I couldn't believe the amount of young men in their 20s and 30s with just bottomed out T levels, even guys that looked relatively fit, but they were doing things like chronic cardio. They were like runners or cyclists. And then as runners and cyclists age, I was just telling one of my girlfriends the other day, she's a clinician, but she didn't really know this. I'm like, yeah, every single marathon runner that I've ever treated eventually basically started bordering or dove straight into diabetes in their 50s, and long distance cyclists. So there's that component too, of that highly oxidative exercise where they're not building a lot of muscle and maybe they're actually in a catabolic state. They think they're doing the right thing because that's how we were taught in the 80s in my age group. You know, it was like cardio, but they're not building muscle. They're not optimizing their testosterone levels. And then and they tend to like to drink, you know, I would throw alcohol into the mix. Like you said, there's so many factors here. And then these guys would end up with basically pre-diabetic or diabetic labs, and they'd get mad at me. They're like, that's impossible. I run 20 miles a week, or I cycle 100 miles a week. And I'm like, well, you look like a diabetic. And they're rail thin and they don't know what's going on. So can we just touch on that for a second? Because I want the guys to really let this one hit home, that they got to be doing the deadlifts and the squats.
Oh yeah. So I like, who gave this example one time? I want to say it was the Mind Pump guys. I love those guys.
Those guys are great.
I think it was, yeah, I think he gave this example. He said, you know, don't get me wrong, cardio is fantastic. And if you're doing cardio and that's all you're doing, all for it. But cardio is kind of like cashing a check, and then lifting weights is like making the investment. It's investing that money, right? And this can be interesting to a lot of members that are wearing CGMs that I help at NutriSense, because you see it's more immediate gratification when you do cardio and see your glucose go nice down, slow and steady. Sometimes when you lift weights, you even see an increase, but that's actually expected. And it's kind of interesting. All that actually means is you actually might need a little more carbohydrate in your diet, because all it means is that the energy demand is exceeding the energy availability in your body. But that's a separate conversation. And also when you're working out, when you're actively working out, there's something called non-insulin mediated uptake into the cells with glucose, where you actually don't even need insulin to process that glucose out of the bloodstream into the muscles for energy. So a lot going on when you're working out that's super beneficial. But what I said about what I meant by saying lifting weights is more of an investment, what I meant by that was that when you develop your muscle, you have bigger glucose storage tanks. You have more ability to dispose of glucose at any given time. So when you get stronger, you can talk about, getting stronger versus hypertrophy versus this. That's another separate conversation. But when you get stronger, you can assume there's probably going to be a little bit of muscle gained, actual tissue that's gained. So any kind of resistance training is going to be super beneficial for your glucose, even if you don't see it in the immediate future. There's definitely a huge investment you're making, because developed muscle is going to store and metabolize glucose better.